I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Near the end of 1945, the United States government began releasing over 100,000 remaining Japanese Americans that were being held in internment camps throughout the West and Midwest. For the internees, rather than a sense of relief after 3 years of incarceration, leaving the camp confines carried with it the heavy burden of anxiety, uncertainty, and fear. They were afraid to return home for three main reasons. First, because of the devastation and slaughter Japan had inflicted upon the United States, Japanese Americans feared they would be looked upon and treated as America's enemies. Secondly, still painfully aware of the resentment and prejudice many citizens still held towards Japanese American farmers and business owners, the internees were uncertain and anxious about their future economic survival. Finally, because Japanese American internees had little faith that their civil rights would be honored, they feared the police, fire department, and local governments would do little to protect them if a crisis arose. As a result, newly freed Japanese Americans were understandably nervous and fearful of returning home, not even knowing if their homes or farms still existed.
When the war ended with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the camps began to close. I believe that there was a court ruling also. But remember, if you lost your farm, if you had sons that served in the 442 or in the Pacific and died, and you were 70 years old, what would you go to? Where would you go? There was no farm. Your children were scattered. Maybe your son didn't die, but he's still in the army. Where would you go? What would you do? This was a dilemma for some people. Some were lucky, like our family. Bob Fletcher saved our farm. The Jenkins had made sure that nobody burned my grandfather's house. Some people had a place to go, but many didn't. And in this area around Sacramento, about 85% did not return.
Many people have talked about the difficulties they had in returning, and not just finding housing, because they didn't have any home to go back to, or in some cases they had their home and all the furniture that was in the house had been stolen. They lost everything. But we were fortunate. We had our things stored in the church. And when my father and mother and younger brother came back to Bakersfield, they were able to stay in the church, using the church as the hostel. And some other families also lived in those rooms.
The minister at the Parkview Japanese Presbyterian Church opened up the church as a hostel. So people returning would go there and sleep in the church, in the social hall, and temporarily, and until they found their home housing. And that really helped. But they said it was very difficult to find housing. A lot of people won't rent to Japanese.
I understand that there was a family living in our home at the time of our return, and that my father eventually had to go find a place for them to move to before they would leave. And then the topper was that my sister said that it was just a total wreck. The bathrooms were filled with garbage. The floors had about an inch or two of just crud.
Even though the evacuees knew they had done nothing wrong, being held in the internment camps month after month, year after year, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, many Japanese Americans began to feel as though they really were bad people. Finally, when they were released from camp, many older adults had already lost confidence in themselves, no longer having the energy, the will, or the resources to start life over again. The children, too, were fearful of returning to the schools they had once attended. Thankfully for them, there were many caring teachers and students that came forward to welcome the Japanese American children and accept them as friends. Sadly, however, other Japanese American children were not so fortunate. Their teachers, seemingly without concern, reinforced the feelings of inferiority and worthlessness that most Japanese American children had already begun to feel about themselves.
For a long time after we left the camp, nobody wanted to talk about it. You know, when you're put into a place like that with barbed wire and sentries around it and not allowed to leave, you feel shamed. You feel like you must have done something wrong. Even if I don't feel like I've done anything wrong, there must have been something about me that was bad.
That experience coming out, I guess by that time I was 10 and I was, you know, having lived with nothing but Japanese people, you know, all these 3 years, I was afraid of going out to a new place because I thought, oh, they're going to call us dirty Japs. Because I guess in those days, I must have felt like it was our fault that Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor. And so I did have feelings like that.
When I came home, I realized that there was so much anti-Japanese feeling, and it came to me in the classroom or outside. People were still calling us names, and very often they were more likely to say bad things to children than to a grown-up. In the classroom, the teacher handled things very differently. Miss Webster, my 6th grade teacher, and we had News Friday. People read a news event and they would give a report. And very often the boys would talk about where we were in the war. Even though the war was over by September of 1945, there were still activities going on in the Far East or in Germany or wherever. And wherever they were talking about things that might affect the Japanese, they were using the language that was seen in the newspapers. They used the word Japs instead of Japanese, and that was a not nice word. It's a derogatory word. And Miss Webster would say, "Oh, Wayne, let's use the word Japanese. That's so much nicer." And so pretty soon Wayne is talking about Japanese now. And then the next Friday somebody else, Franklin, is talking about the Japs. And here we go again. Miss Webster say, "Oh, let's say Japanese, that nice word." And about the 3rd time that somebody says it, that's the last time we ever had it. So she used that way of nicely correcting. I think that plus the lady who helped me in the school ground, it just generated this feeling of how can we help children become accepted and inclusive. Whereas this other little boy, George Takei, who is now an actor, and he came back, he was in the 3rd grade, and he went to school in Los Angeles too. He had a different experience and a different teacher, and that teacher called him the Jap boy. She would not call him, his given name was George. And somebody said to him, because he's writing this in his memoirs, in his book, "Didn't you know that that was a bad word, and why didn't you say something about it?" He said, "I knew it was a bad word, but I knew I was a bad person because I was in prison. So I deserved to be called a bad word." See, that's what the internment did to him, put it into his mind that he had this prison experience, therefore he was bad.
A lot of the young Japanese Nisei and Sansei went into, you might say, private practice, like medicine, dentistry, law, because they felt they couldn't get regular jobs like an engineer in firms. They wouldn't be hired. So they went into something that they could do themselves. And of course, they became famous as you know, most people say, well, they want somebody that's maybe Japanese to be my dentist or my doctor. You know, so the feeling from pre-war to after-war changed a lot.
The period after World War II saw the beginning of societal change for Japanese American people. After the war had ended and the internees returned home, it was extremely difficult for Japanese Americans to get a job working for other people. This is when many decided to risk going out on their own, some as professionals, and others as farmers, pooling their resources to create farm co-ops. The farm co-ops enabled Japanese American farmers to work together, sharing resources and know-how, rather than competing against each other as rivals in the marketplace. During this same time, many Americans began to realize the terrible injustices the United States had committed against the Japanese American people, stripping them of their precious civil rights without just cause. Returning Caucasian soldiers who had fought with the Japanese American troops were now standing up for these men and their families, praising their bravery, courage, and valor as soldiers of the United States military. Times were indeed changing.
There were 30 documented cases of drive-by shootings, arson, dynamiting of buildings, signs in stores, no Japs allowed here, and things like that. But it changed rather dramatically after World War II. Social changes take generations to change, but it changed overnight there. Pretty soon, these people went to school, became politicians into decision-making positions, and in 1952, almost all of the 500 laws that I previously mentioned were gone. They were overturned. I think it was a combination of sacrifices made by the Japanese Americans who fought in the war and the Caucasian soldiers that fought with them. They brought about these changes.